Okay, so you ready for this? We're diving deep today, like really deep, into some pretty significant shifts we've seen in federal policy.
Yeah, we're talking about some big changes, right? Like a real about-face in how the government approaches certain sectors, certain priorities.
And a lot of this, focuses on this set of presidential determinations from back in 2022. Remember those?
Yeah.
All about boosting domestic clean energy production. Solar, insulation, all that. And then fast forward to 2025 and boom, they get revoked.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. And we've got all this material to dig into, the original determinations, analyses, and then, of course, the executive order that wiped them out, along with a whole bunch of other executive actions, too.
So what we're going to try to do is go beyond just the headlines, right?
Yeah.
We want to figure out, what was the real thinking behind that initial push to build up all that domestic clean energy manufacturing? And why the sudden change of heart?
And maybe even more importantly, what are the real-world consequences going to be?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially for our ability to, actually produce renewable energy here at home and make sure our energy future is secure. What does all this mean for our energy independence?
Big questions.
Big questions, right. So just to be clear, we're specifically looking at those 4 2022 presidential determinations that got the axe. The one about solar, photovoltaic modules and components, insulation, electrolyzers, fuel cells, and platinum group metals, and finally, electric heat pumps. We're going to untangle all of that.
We're in try.
All right, so let's start with, those 2022 initiatives.
Yeah.
What was the thinking there? Why did the government decide they wanted to ramp up all that clean energy manufacturing here at home?
Well, if you look at the language in those 2022 documents, the overall goal was pretty clear.
Yeah.
It was all about promoting domestic production of, quote, renewable and sustainable energy products, unquote. They were really focused on getting the U.S. to be less dependent on other countries for these technologies. And that meant building up our own manufacturing capacity, factories, supply chains, the whole 9 yards.
Makes sense, right? We've seen how fragile global supply chains can be.
Exactly.
And they were talking about using the DPA to make all this happen, right? The Defense Production Act. That's a pretty big deal. Can you remind us what that even is?
Oh, yeah, the DPA. That's a powerful tool.
Powerful. How so?
Well, essentially, it gives the president a lot of authority, a lot.
Okay.
They can use it to basically force companies to prioritize certain contracts, allocate resources in specific ways, and even expand production in industries considered vital to national security.
Wow.
So, in 2022, it seems like they were saying that moving to clean energy and not being so reliant on foreign energy was a matter of national security. That's a huge statement. They were basically comparing it to past oil crises and stuff.
That's really interesting. So they weren't just thinking about economics or the environment.
No, this was bigger. They were thinking about the big picture, geopolitics, who has the power, all that.
So, okay, let's get into the details. Each of those 2022 presidential determinations had its own specific focus. Let's start with solar photovoltaic modules and all the components that go into those.
Yeah.
What was the big idea there? Why did they want to increase domestic production of solar panels?
Well, for starters, it was all about becoming less reliant on other countries for our solar technology. I mean, if you look at where most of our solar panels come from, it's not the U.S.
Right.
And that makes us vulnerable. What if those other countries decided to cut us off or, raise prices?
Not good.
Not good at all.
And I guess it also makes sense, with everything that's been happening with global supply chains, all the disruptions we've seen, better to make it here, right?
Yeah. Right. So by boosting domestic production, they wanted to create a more secure supply chain for solar, make sure we can get the panels we need without having to rely on anyone else. And that ties directly to energy independence. If we can make our own solar panels, we're less dependent on foreign energy sources, which is a huge national security issue. Plus, they probably wanted to stimulate innovation within the U.S. solar industry, encourage more research and development, create jobs, all that.
Right, yeah. Support American businesses.
Yeah.
So it sounds like they were playing the long game with solar, looking ahead to a future where it's a much bigger part of our energy mix.
Exactly. It was a strategic move.
So then there's insulation. That doesn't sound quite as, exciting as solar panels. Why was domestic insulation production such a big deal that it needed its own presidential determination?
Well, if you think about it, insulation plays a huge role in energy efficiency.
Sure.
Right. The better insulated our buildings are, the less energy we waste on heating and cooling.
Which also means we rely less on fossil fuels, right?
Exactly.
And that makes us less vulnerable to price swings in the global energy market.
Exactly. So it's all connected. By making sure we have a reliable supply of insulation made right here in the U.S., they were aiming to reduce our overall energy consumption and make us less dependent on, foreign energy sources.
Right. Makes sense. It's like the less energy we need in the first place, the less we have to worry about where it's coming from.
Exactly.
Okay, on to the next one. This one's a bit more technical. Electrolyzers, fuel cells, and platinum group metals. What were they thinking with this one?
This one's all about the future of energy, specifically hydrogen. Electrolyzers, fuel cells, these are key technologies for a hydrogen-based energy system. Electrolyzers use electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and fuel cells do the reverse to generate electricity with just water as a byproduct. They're both really clean processes, and platinum group metals are super important because they act as catalysts in these systems. They make the whole thing work.
Okay,
So the idea was to position the U.S. as a leader in hydrogen energy.
I get it.
By promoting domestic manufacturing of electrolyzers, fuel cells, and securing a steady supply of platinum group metals, they were trying to make sure we're at the forefront of this emerging technology.
And they were thinking ahead, making sure we have the resources and the expertise to produce these things here so we don't have to rely on other countries.
Exactly. They were playing the long game, anticipating that hydrogen is going to be a big deal in the future.
So in a way, it's kind of like the solar thing, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's about investing in the future of energy, making sure we have control over these key technologies, and ultimately making the U.S. more energy independent.
Okay, the last one from 2022. Electric heat pumps. What was the focus there?
This one's all about electrifying heating and cooling in buildings.
Okay.
Most heating and cooling systems still run on fossil fuels,
Yeah.
but electric heat pumps, they offer a much cleaner alternative, especially if the electricity they're using comes from renewable sources.
Right.
So by supporting domestic production of electric heat pumps, they were trying to make these cleaner options more readily available and encourage people to switch over.
Makes sense. So it's all about reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and making our buildings more sustainable.
Exactly.
So if we look back at those 2022 presidential determinations, there's a common thread, right? It's all about taking a proactive approach, building up domestic manufacturing in those key clean energy sectors and trying to make the U.S. more energy independent.
Absolutely. It was a clear strategy. They weren't just reacting to things. They were trying to shape the future of energy in a way that benefits the U.S.
But then everything changed in 2025, right?
Yeah.
That's when those 2022 actions got revoked.
Yeah, March 14th, 2025. Big day.
What happened?
A new executive order came out. The title was Additional Rescissions of Harmful Executive Orders and Actions.
Catchy.
Real catchy, right?
So what did it say? Like, why did they reverse course on all that clean energy stuff?
Well, the stated reason in the order itself was pretty broad. It was all about, and I'm quoting here, restoring common sense to the federal government and unleashing the potential of American citizens.
Okay. That's interesting.
Right. It's a pretty loaded language.
It is. It's like they're saying those 2022 actions were somehow like anti-common sense and that they were holding people back.
Yeah, that's definitely the implication. The new administration seemed to think that those earlier policies were just bad ideas and that a different approach, probably one with less government involvement, would be better for everyone.
So are they saying that the government shouldn't be involved in trying to shape these industries? Like, just let the free market do its thing?
That seems to be the underlying philosophy.
But what about the arguments in favor of those 2022 initiatives? Like, what were the potential downsides of revoking them?
Well, there were a lot of concerns. Critics were worried that this reversal would slow down the development of clean energy technologies here in the U.S. and make us more dependent on foreign sources again. All the things those 2022 actions were trying to prevent.
Makes sense. So basically, they were worried about undoing all the progress that had been made.
Exactly. And there were worries about stifling innovation in these industries. Building a strong domestic manufacturing base for things like solar panels and heat pumps is seen by a lot of people as essential for a successful clean energy transition.
Right. It's about creating jobs too, right?
Absolutely. Revoking these policies could have a negative impact on job creation in the renewable energy sector, which is a growing part of our economy.
Yeah.
And then there's the big picture, climate change.
Yeah.
Critics were worried that slowing down the clean energy transition would set back our efforts to address climate change and make our energy future less secure.
So on the other side, they're saying that the 2022 policies were actually good and that the government does have a role to play in all of this.
Right. They'd argue that active government involvement is necessary to protect our energy security, maintain our competitiveness in these emerging industries, and make sure we're doing what we need to do to protect the environment. It's a fundamental disagreement about the role of government.
And this 2025 executive order didn't just target clean energy, right?
Oh, no. It was much broader than that.
Like what else?
Well, it revoked a whole bunch of other executive actions. Just to give you a few examples.
Okay.
There was one about defense supply chain resilience, making sure we have reliable sources for the things our military needs. That got revoked. There was another one about responding to public health threats, like pandemics. That got revoked too.
Whoa.
And then there were those presidential determinations on using the DPA for infant formula.
Oh, wow. That one caused a lot of controversy, right?
Yeah, it did. And those got revoked too.
So they are really rolling back a lot of things.
Yeah, it was a pretty sweeping executive order.
And for each of those revocations, there were people who were really concerned about the potential consequences.
Absolutely.
Like for the defense supply chain one, people were worried about making our military more vulnerable.
Right. If we're not careful about where we're getting the things our military needs, we could be putting ourselves at risk.
And revoking the public health order, right after a pandemic, that doesn't seem like the best timing.
Yeah, a lot of people were worried that it would make us less prepared for future health emergencies.
And the infant formula one is just, scary.
Yeah, no one wants to see a repeat of that crisis.
It's like they're saying that the government shouldn't be involved in these things. But then what happens when things go wrong?
That's the big question.
Right?
And it's not just about practical concerns either.
What do you mean?
Well, there were also revocations that touched on social and human rights issues.
Oh, right.
Like, there was a memorandum on LGBTQI plus human rights globally that got revoked.
That was a big deal.
Yeah, and revoking it raised concerns about whether the U.S. was still committed to protecting those rights around the world.
Right, like what message does that send?
Exactly.
And then there was the one about federal support for tribal nations.
That was another big one. Revoking that order raised concerns about the relationship between the federal government and tribal governments and whether the U.S. was honoring its treaty obligations.
So it's not just about, energy in the economy.
No, it's much broader than that. These revocations touched on a whole range of issues, and they really highlight the different philosophies at play here.
Yeah, it's like two completely different ways of thinking about the role of government.
Exactly.
And, the thing is, it's not just an academic debate.
Right.
These policy changes have real-world consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely.
So for you listening, we want you to think about this. What do you think the role of government should be? Should it be actively involved in shaping industries, addressing social issues, and engaging with the world? Or should it take a step back and let things play out more naturally? It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
It really is, and there are strong arguments to be made on both sides.
Exactly. So we encourage you to keep learning, keep digging into these issues. You can find all the source documents we've been talking about on our website.
And you can always reach out to us with your thoughts and questions.
Absolutely. We love hearing from you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.